So your views on America have changed, I would say, over the years.
Well, of course, the biggest single revision that all of this, excuse me, certainly the biggest single revision that all of this has involved for me and has a part in all the other ones is revisiting one's view of the United States,
Yeah.
yes. I was having a discussion the other day in London during a debate over the liberation of Iraq where I was speaking against some American liberals and with a friend of mine who until quite recently had been a member of the British Communist Party. And we had taken the side of Jalal Talabani and Barham Salih and Kanan Makir and the other Iraqi left and secular revolutionary intellectuals that the Saddam Hussein regime had to go, that no policy was conceivable that allowed it to retain private ownership of Iraq. I would have thought a pretty easy case to make. And my friend, I've recently ex-communist friend, in the debate said, look, I know what all the criticisms of American imperialism are, and I've made them myself, and I could add the same with my book on Henry Kissinger's crimes and so forth. But if there is going to be a superpower or a hyperpower in global affairs, I'm very glad, he went on to say, that it's the United States and not any of the possible rivals. Well, that's common sense to me too.
Mm-hmm. Well, you wrote a book 20 years ago about the Anglosphere,
Yes.
which was more critical than perhaps you would be today. What's changed that makes the concept more palatable to you?
Well, I still think, which is what my book was about, that the more or less direct succession by American policy and institutions after 1945 of British imperial responsibilities wasn't a good thing for the United States, and not that good a thing for the territories that it inherited either. I'd mentioned the disputed territories that were still there at the end of the empire: Palestine, Cyprus, Kashmir, so on the borderlines which we're still fighting over, as a matter of fact. Well, I don't think it was an admirable or fortunate thing that happened, nor, in fact, the American succession in other parts of the world to the empires of Portugal in Africa, Belgium in Africa, Holland in Indonesia and elsewhere. These are very, very spotty periods indeed, and I think deserve maybe more criticism than they got. But everything has to do with the alternative. And now that there isn't what you could call an idealistic, internationalist, secular, leftist opposition to this globally, there's nothing of the kind. It becomes much plainer who the real rivals are. So I would say, for example, that certainly the cruelest master Zimbabwe's ever had, a country where I was very much involved at one point when it was still Rhodesia, is not just Mugabe locally, but its imperial boss, his imperial boss, China, is by far the cruelest master that Zimbabwe. And if you make that extension, which is unhappily easy to do, to Darfur, Burma, North Korea, there's quite a long list. I may have left something out. Everywhere where human rights are not just denied, but literally negated, the superpower of China is behind it. And blood for oil is the simplest way, for once, simplicity works in this case, of encapsulating it. And one misses the idea that there's an American willingness to resist this. Though there is some, it feels faint, and one wishes it to be stronger.
You've written a lot about the Eastern sin of communism, but also the Western sin of imperialism. Do you think it's easy to lump these together, and are there distinctions that need to be made between the two, and also within imperialism? Was the British Empire as bad or nasty as the Belgian Empire was?
Well, if you ask me to compare and contrast progress made by imperialisms, or as opposed to retrogressive things done by them, my favorite writing on this always was and still is Karl Marx's brilliant essays on India, where he said, it's absurd to go on about the British oppression or occupation of India because it's not as if India would be unoccupied without the British. It would be now dominated either by Russia, possibly Turkey, conceivably Persia. Not then, I think, China, but that doesn't invalidate the same point. And he said the British Empire is undoubtedly using India for what I would call extractive reasons, converting its people and raw materials into capital without very much concern in order to finance the British Industrial Revolution. Nonetheless, this has brought to India He enumerates them. The railway, the printing press, he thought that was of the highest importance, the telegraph, and steamship communication with other cultures. It ended the millennial stagnation and isolation of India. But all of this is to the benefit of the Indian people, and it also means in the end they will be able to have their own modern, relatively modern, prosperous, post-British state. Actually, not only was it the correct analysis at the time, which left out nothing by way of a critique of the way the British treated their subjects, but objectively it was quite a good predictor of what India is now. Mm-hmm. The British record in Ireland doesn't strike me that way at all. I mean, and parts of West Africa and elsewhere. I don't think one can say that it harnessed the energies, emancipated the labour force and savings or any of this sort of thing as it did in India. Mm-hmm. And I hope my accent doesn't betray me or compromise me, but I still think, a good case to be made, if you have to be colonised, don't be colonised by the Belgians. For one thing, it's a terrible thing to be colonised by a country that's already practically a colony itself and backward and impoverished and narrow. And best of all, is to have your own free economy and free institutions and an alliance with other countries that have the same. The Anglosphere is a prefiguration of that, I suppose, rather imperfect, rather inexact, but not bad.
Mm. The least bad of the...
And just to give you an example of how the promptings of the left don't leave me, or I don't think can be left out of this either. South Africa wasn't, in fact, English-speaking entirely. It was an Afrikaner-dominated and Dutch-run totalitarian system, in my opinion, because I think racism is totalitarianism by definition. Run by people whose party leadership had actually been on the other side in the Second World War. And I would say, if I'd been asked as late as the 1970s, a worse place to live in and a worse disgrace to human values than, say, Cuba was, or even is now.
South Africa.
Yes. So that the separations aren't all that easy but to make. They're not that difficult either. Mm-hmm. And then I would have added, and I should have said it already, I always thought, and I still think, that a nuclear war would be worse than any possible political outcome. It would be totalitarianism defined for the survivors. It would be back to the most appalling tyranny of scarcity and famine and want and ruin. That's self-evident, but it would also be the end not just of our generation, but of all the generations that have come before us to build civilization. And so my anxiety to avoid anything that could lead to what was pathetically, wickedly, I thought, euphemistically called a nuclear exchange, was very strong and still is. And one would, in the better dead than red calculus, have no difficulty at all deciding. And don't forget, there were people at that time who honestly did think that the risk of that was worth running. For Cuba, for heaven's sake. Even for Vietnam in the 50s. And then I thought was the spirit of fascism transmuted into the discourse of the West, and I was very much against it, and I don't regret that one bit.